Hey, we're back again. It's time for another submarine story. So what do you say we rig for red? Settle in on the midwatch and tell a good one. My name's Patrick LeBlanc, and I served on 7 submarines over nearly 20 years in the Navy. But it all had to start somewhere. So today I'm going to tell you the story of how the whole thing started. So I was in 11th grade in Heartland High School in Heartland, Michigan. And we were coming up near the end of the year, and we were going out on a field trip to plant some trees for an ecology class. And a couple of us brought along a bottle of rum, and I got into that bottle of rum, and I got drunk, and of course I got caught, and I got thrown out of school with about 5 days left of school. So, needless to say, my aunt and uncle who were raising me, Aunt Gertie and Uncle Harold, they were not happy. Particularly my Aunt Gertie, because my Uncle Harold had a tendency to drink, and she didn't like that much when he did it, and she liked it even less when I did it. So, and I was 16, and she wasn't going to tolerate that. But my birthday was coming up. It was right around the 1st of June, and they were building a house up in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, which is about 350 miles due north of where they lived. It's in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And anyway, so they're building a house up there on 100 acres, and the outside construction's called a pole barn when they built it up there. So they had this 30 by 60 structure built. So there was, roof trusses being put on, and so it was an opportunity for her to go up a little early, because not like I was in school anymore. So her and I went up there, and that was probably the longest 6-hour ride of my life, because I don't think she said one damn word to me. Anyhow, we got up there, and there was a whole bunch of construction materials being delivered. And this picture of this building is 30 by 60. It's got siding on it all the way around. It's got a garage door. It's got a manway door that's about 4 feet off the ground on the right side as you faced it, and one on the ground on the left side on the opposite side where the garage door was. So it had roof joists put on it, and they were just getting ready to roof it. And actually, I take it back. They had just roofed it, and that's where part of the problem came in. So anyway, it's dark inside the building. It's very bright outside the building, and so it had the roofing on it, but it hadn't been shingled yet, as I recall. And we're going back, 45 years or so. But anyway, so a whole bunch of stuff had to go in because they were getting ready to put the floor joist trusses in, and the floor was going to be built up about 3 feet off the ground on the right end where that other door was. And so anyway, the whole bunch of this stuff had to get carted in, and she figured that was a good thing for me to do, and I'd have had to do it whether it was punishment or not. So anyway, we got up there, and we're staying in this little itty-bitty travel trailer that they stayed in while the house was being built. And my Uncle Harold was going to filter up there about 2 weeks later when he hit his vacation from work. Anyhow, I'm carrying these 16-foot long 2x4s in 2 at a time and bringing them in. And when you come into a building that's dark like that, it didn't have any windows cut in it yet. It was just the 2 doors that were open and the garage door open. You come in, and it's hard to see because of the change in light. Well, she had gone in on ahead of me, and I didn't even really know she was in there. But I'm struggling with these 16-foot long boards, and I'm carrying them in the middle, and they're kind of bouncing while they're going in. Anyway, I hit her square in the backside and knocked her on her ass, and just ran right into her and knocked her down. And she got up, and she was on fire, hell bent to just rip me a new one. And she was yelling and screaming and carrying on and putting her finger in my face, and you did that on purpose, and you did that on purpose, and you're nothing but a damn drunk. And well, it went on and on and on and on, and she just wouldn't stop. And finally, I guess I just had enough. So I said, "Fuck you." And that didn't it wasn't the right thing to do. Looking back on it, I wish I had never said that, but I did. And she lost her mind again. And she told me my mother was rolling over in her grave, and I was nothing but a damn drunk, and I did blah, 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 blah. Anyway, long story short, I got pissed off, walked back to the trailer, grabbed a pillowcase, stuffed a pair of jeans in it, a t-shirt, a pair of underwear, grabbed my wallet, walked down the road. And she was behind me waving her finger. Well, I don't know where the hell you're going. You're not getting in it. Well, truth be told, the place we were at in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan was called Lower Hay Lake Road. And if you can find that on a map, it's probably still a dirt road. And it's 10 miles from town in Sault Ste. Marie. And about 6 miles of that trip is on a gravel road. And then you hit pavement. And then the pavement goes from being like 2 lanes to 3 lanes with the turn lane. Then it gets into 4 lanes, and then you're in town. But anyway, so I started walking. And from where they were building their house to where they actually got to the road to walk was a half a mile all by itself. So I walked that half a mile, and I made the right, and they had about a half a mile of property facing. And I walked down that road, and I got to the neighbor's house, and his name was A. Blake. And that's what was painted on his mailbox. And I remember that being just as plain as day. It was a black mailbox, and it said A. Blake right there. And I was in front of that mailbox, and I heard a car coming. And I turned around and looked around, and it was a pickup truck. And guy pulled up next to me. He says, "Where are you going?" And I said, "I'm going into town." He said, "Do you want to ride?" I said, "Sure." And it was him and his wife up front, and there was a lady and a couple of kids in the back. And I hopped in back with them, and these kids were twins, and that was their mama, and I guess it was grandma and grandpa up front driving, and they were giggling, and we're driving along, and this girl says, "Well, where are you going?" And I said, "Well, I'm going into town." And she says, "Well, what are you doing there?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to join the Army." And she was like, "Join the Army?" And these kids were like, "Join the Army?" Anyway, go along, and it takes about 15, 20 minutes to get into town. A lot of gravel road. You don't make a good speed or nothing. But anyway, got into town. He drove me right up in front of the Armed Forces Recruiting Center, right there across from the Sioux Locks in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. And I hopped out of the truck and said, "Thank you very much," and walked across the street, and I walked in. And there's this lady sitting there at the desk, and she was, I don't know, about 30 years old or so. And I said hello, and she said hello, and she asked what I was there for, and I said I wanted to see the Army recruiter. And she said, "Hang on just a second." She pushed a button, picked up the phone, and she said, "Sergeant Anderson, you got a fish on the hook." So this guy come out. He's a staff sergeant, and he's in his Army greens, and he walks out, and kind of a dressier uniform with ribbons on it, like an office uniform. And he walks out and introduces himself as Sergeant Anderson. He shakes my hand and asks me what's going on. He says, "Well, you're a big strapping young man. Come on in." And got back to his office, and he pulled out a big package of paperwork, and he said, "Well, got some questions. He said, gotta get this going." And I said, "Okay." He says, "Well, when you looking to go in the Army?" And I said, "Well, today." And he said, "Well," he said, "it doesn't happen just quite that fast." He says, "But we'll get the paperwork put together." He says, "You could probably go down to Detroit to the facility where they process people. It's called MEPS. And you'll go down there," and he said, "Be a day or two, but you get down there and they'll process you in, give you a physical, and assuming you pass the physical and everything, you'd go from there." And I said, "Okay, well, let's go." So he sits down, he asks me my name, and he writes it down, and he asks me my address, and I give him the address down in Brighton. And he says, "Well, Brighton, what are you doing up here?" And I explained to him that I was up there, and I wasn't getting along with my aunt, and it was time to leave. And he says, "Okay." So he says, "Do you know your Social Security number?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And he wrote that down, and he says, "Well, what's your birthday?" And I said, "June 5th, 1962. And he says, "Oh, you got a birthday coming up." And he wrote that down, and he said, "Wait a minute." And he did this. It was kind of like, he said, "You're only 16 years old." And I said, "Yes, sir." I said, "But I'll be 17 in a couple days." And he said, "But you're only 16 years old." And I said, "Yeah, but I'll be 17 in a couple days." He says, "Have you graduated high school?" And I said, "No." I said, "I just kind of sort of finished the 11th grade." And he said, You don't have a GED then, do you?" And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "Son, if you don't know what it is, you don't got one." He said, "So if you don't have a GED and you don't have a high school diploma and you're not 18 years old, you can't join this man's Army." And I said, "Oh." And he said, "So that could be quite a problem." And I said, "Yeah." He said, "So how bad do you really want to leave?" And I said, "Real bad. I kind of got no place to go back to." I said, "I kind of burned the bridge." He said, "Well, have you ever thought about going in the Navy?" And I said, "No." I said, my dad was in the Army. Most of my uncles were in the Army. I said, I did have an uncle who was in the Navy, and he's a pretty nice guy, but he never talked anything about being in the Navy. And, my Uncle Leonard was in the Navy. He was in World War II, and he just never talked about it at all. So he said, well, I think the Navy's taking people. He says, because they're desperate. And he says, let me give this guy a call. So he called out to the secretary, and he said, hey, where's Mac at? And I hear like Charlie Brown's mother on the phone. And he says, well, I'll tell you what. He said, this guy's right down the street. He said, he's in the VFW, and he's in a Navy uniform. You can't miss him. He said, you go down there and find him and tell him I sent you, and he'll take care of you. And I said, okay, well, hey, thanks, Sergeant Anderson. So I went out there, and this lady, Karen, said, see you later. You'll be back in a couple minutes. And I said, okay. So I walked on down the street, and it was, I don't know, maybe a block or two. The Armed Forces Recruiting Center sat between a taffy shop and an ice cream shop. And one door down from that was a bar called the Moose. And that wasn't the real name of the bar, but there was a moose head on the wall. And it's just off the corner in Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. So anyway, I walked down the street a little farther to the VFW. And I got there and I opened the door and I walked in and looked around, and there's some guys sitting at the, you got to, it's like 10 o'clock in the morning. There's a bunch of old guys sitting at the bar. And there's this one guy in black pants and a white shirt wearing a combination cap tipped back on his head, and he was having a beer at 10 o'clock in the morning. And anyway, I walked in and I walked up and I said, "Is your name Mac?" And he turned around and says, "That sure is. Who'd ask it?" And I said, "Well, Sergeant Anderson sent me, and I'm trying to get out of town, and I was trying to join the Army, and I'm not old enough, and I don't have a high school diploma." And he said that maybe you could help me out. He said, "So you want to join the Navy, eh?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I guess." He said, "Well, come on." And he finished his beer, pounded it down on the bar, and we walked on down the street back to the recruiting office, and there was this lady. Turns out her name was Karen. And Karen says, "Well, I told you you'd be back, hon." And he says, "Hey, can you give me a package out of my folder?" And she says, "Sure." And he's kind of, he got the hiccups going, Anyway, so we get in his office, and she comes in and hands him a package of papers. It's probably much like the same package of papers the Army had. And we started the questions all over again. We got a little deeper into this one, though. He says, "Have you smoked marijuana?" And I said, "No." He says, "You're sure you haven't smoked marijuana?" And I said, "Real sure." He says, "Because they're going to give you a test, a drug test, and they're going to figure it out if you did. You can't. It's no drugs." And I said, "Okay." He said, "They'll kick you right out." And I said, "Okay." He says, "You don't take any drugs?" I said, "No." He says, "Now, are you a homosexual?" And I said, "What?" He says, "It doesn't matter if you are, but you need to say no." And I was like, "What?" And he was like, "No, you got to say no. Not what. Say no." I said, "No." He said, "Okay." He says, "I think I believe you too." And anyway, I explained that, I was only 16, but I was going to be 17 in a couple days. And he said, "Well, what we can do is," he says, we'll get some petty cash out of the fund. We'll put you up at the hotel above the Moose for a couple days." He said, "We'll wait." And he said, "We'll ship you down there on Monday." This is like Friday. "We'll ship you down there on Monday, and we'll date the paperwork for Tuesday, and we'll get you down there, and it'll be your birthday, and you can join the Navy." And I said, "Okay." He says, "Ain't nothing." He said, "You ain't got flat feet. You ain't got a heart problem. You ain't got..." And I said, "No, not that I know of." He said, "They'll give you a physical." And he says, "It's pretty invasive." He says, "You'll know." Anyway, he says, "Now the only problem is we got to have somebody sign for you to get in." And I was like, He says, "Do you think that's going to be a problem?" And I said, "Well, I'm not talking to my Aunt Gertie, and I'm not gonna." I said, "So that means we need to talk to my Uncle Harold." And I explained that they were my guardians, and he said, "Yeah, that'll do just fine." So anyway, he picks up the phone, and rotary phone, and calls, and my uncle answers the phone, and he works midnights. So by this time, it's about 11:30, so probably woke him up. He was pissed. And he had no idea that any of this was going on. Nobody's got a cell phone back then, right? And it's not like Aunt Gertie just dropped everything and ran into town to call Uncle Harold and tell him I ran away. So anyway, got him on the phone, and the recruiter's talking to him, and I start talking to him, and my uncle's like, "What in the hell is wrong with you? What are you doing?" And I told him what happened. And he said, "Well, that sounds just like your Aunt Gertie." He says, "But I don't know." He said, "I promised your mother you'd get an education, and I promised her you'd graduate." And I said, "Well, and this guy takes the phone back. So we can get him a GED. The Navy will give him training." He said, "We'll find a way to guarantee him an A school, And I had no idea what an A school was. He says, he'll learn a trade, he'll come out, a better man for it, and he'll see the world. And my uncle had him put me back on the phone, and we talked a little bit, and there were some tears, and they weren't on his end. And anyway, he said, well, my uncle said, I'll sign the papers on one condition. He says, you send him back down here to Brighton on the way to Detroit, and give him and me a chance to talk, and then he can go on. And he said, I'll drive him down to this MEPS place. And this guy's name was Dan McPherson. And he's like, yeah, that'll work. Anyway, so we're sitting there and we're talking and get through all this whole package of papers, all this stuff, right? And it's a application for security clearance. You fill out all kinds of crap when you join the Navy, Anyway, so I'm looking and kind of looking at his uniform. He says, yeah, he says, these are my ribbons. He says, I was on an air crew. And I said, well, what's your rank? And he says, well, I got 3 chevrons. And he says, that makes me a first-class petty officer. And I said, oh, okay. He says, so I'm an E6. He says, you're going in as an E1. And oh, okay, you're going to be a seaman recruit. Okay. So anyway, he makes some phone calls and does his thing, and I'm sitting there and just kind of looking around and doing. So they got me MSA school, so I'm going to go in and be a cook. Well, something's better than nothing, right? Because I didn't have any skills, didn't have a high school diploma, and the only thing I'd ever really done for a job, I was an ice cream jerk at a Tasty Freeze, right? Make ice cream cones, pass them out the window, collect a little cash. And he said, well, that sets you up to be a cook. Okay, well, it's something, right? So I got to school, and that satisfies Uncle Harold, and I'm going to go and hop on the bus. But I asked him, I said, so what's with your ribbons there? What's all that? I said, what's that one on the top? And it was purple and white. He said, that's a Purple Heart. And I said, wow, Purple Heart, you were wounded in combat? And he's like, yeah, you know about that? I said, yeah, I got uncles that were. I said, a couple of my uncles have a Purple Heart. He says, I call it the enemy marksmanship ribbon. He said, I was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and I wasn't fast enough. I was like, oh. And he said, so anyway, he tells me he was a photographer's mate, and he would fly on aircraft and take pictures, and sometimes they'd shoot back, and he was in an airplane or a helicopter, I don't remember which now, but he got shot, and he got the Purple Heart. So that was his story, but I never forgot that he called it an enemy marksmanship ribbon. And I got a whole lot more respect for guys that end up with a Purple Heart than that. But that was his story and not mine. I'll let that go on by. Anyway, so come time, I come out and he tells Karen to get petty cash out and put me up at the hotel, and we need a couple days. And she kind of looks at me, kind of looks at him, and she says, honey, do you like pizza? And I said, well, yes, ma'am. She says, don't call me ma'am. I'm not old enough for you to call me ma'am. And I said, okay. She said, my name's Karen. I didn't know that before then. Maybe I did. Hell, I don't know. Anyway, worked out. She took the petty cash, bought pizza, took me home, and I stayed on her couch for a couple days till Monday morning, and they put me on a bus about 5 o'clock in the morning, and I went from Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan, and down to Detroit on the bus. And I actually stopped in Brighton, and my uncle picked me up, and we went and had dinner at a Chinese place right there in Brighton, and he took me down to Detroit, and they took me to the MEP station, and got in there, and they processed me, and the next thing I know, later that evening, I was on a train to Chicago, and off I went to boot camp. And I got to boot camp, and it was just like summer camp for older boys. You go through clothing issue, they shave your head, they do this, all their stuff, and some guys didn't deal with this really well, but I didn't have any problem with it. They told me what to do, I did it, and I just kind of knew to keep my head down, my mouth shut, and things went really well for me. And we were in about the third week, and the company commander guy, who was a chief, he was a chief gunner's mate, he called me and got me in the office, and he looked at me, he says, boy, how old are you? And I said, 17. And he said, have you ever shaved? And I said, no, not really. He said, because I've been noticing, he says, guys, they kind of keep an eye on things. He says, I see all them other guys shaving every morning. He says, I ain't never seen you shave. And I said, well, I shaved the first day I got here. And I said, there's really, hadn't grown back yet. And he's like, son of a biscuit. He says, you're still wet behind the ears. He says, who's the damn pedophile that put you in the Navy? And I said, pedophile? What's that anyway? So he kind of asked me what I was going, what's going on, all this kind of stuff. He said, well, they called and asked me to send you to see this lieutenant commander. And he said, I'm going to give you a walking shit, and you're going to go down there and see this guy. Well, we had just finished service week, and I worked in the scullery for the first 3 days, and then they sent me off to a warehouse to help offload trucks into a freezer. So frozen food come in, I offloaded off the truck and put it in the freezer, and this third class MS female was telling us where to put the food, so it was kind of hard work. We were working like 12-hour days, and that part where working in the scullery, that sucked really bad. So they kind of knew what they were doing, but I had really good test scores, and I didn't know you take this test called the ASVAB, and I took that test, and I did really well on it. And I've been going to school, and it just all kind of made sense, So just fill in the bubbles, and there we go. Anyway, I walk on down, and I go in to see this lieutenant commander, and I should have known something was up the minute I got there. And he was like, "Come on in. Do you smoke? Would you like a cigarette? How about a cigar?" I was like, "Oh no, sir, I don't smoke." And he says, "Well, how about a pop? Would you like a Coke?" I was like, "Well, sure." He opens up a bottle of Coke and gives it to me, and we're talking just like, like I'm somebody and not just some rookie recruit, because, you ain't nobody when you're in boot camp. And anyway, he says, "I got this guy coming over to talk to you," and he says, "We're going to talk about nuclear power." I said, "Nuclear power?" He says, "Yeah." He said, "You did really well in the test," and he said, "We'd like to, talk to you about nuclear power and maybe going to submarines." And I said, "Submarines?" And he says, "Yeah." And I was like, big-eyed, just like deer in the headlights kind of look. Anyway, they're knocking on the door, and this guy comes in, and he's a first-class machinist mate. Turns out he's a nuke off of submarines, and he's got silver dolphins. The commander's got gold dolphins, and they start pitching submarines to me. And well, it turns out that you cannot be 17 years old and go through nuclear power school because you're not old enough to absorb ionizing radiation. Surprise, surprise. So I couldn't go to nuke school. But they got me out of going to MSA school, and they said, "Well, that stuff you're doing in the scullery, you don't want to do that on some damn aircraft carrier for the next 4 years, do you? Because that's what MSs do." And it was like, no thanks. So yeah, we can go to submarines. We'll send you to this thing called the Subfarer program. You don't have to pick a job now. You can go there and you can try out all kinds of different stuff, which is just about bullshit. Because what it is you're going to go there and handle lines and chip paint and do all the shit work, and you end up working in a galley anyway. That's called mess cooking. Yeah, surprise, surprise. That's not my finger. Anyhow, they talked me into going to submarines, and the hook was, yeah, you get all this extra money. They give you submarine pay, they give you sea pay while you're on a submarine, and you go with nuclear power school and you get pro pay and all this kind of stuff. Well, it turns out, like I said, I wasn't eligible to go to nuclear power school, so I ended up with Subfarer, and I went, and that's how I ended up down in sub school. And that's about enough for me to tell you about now, but off I was going to submarine school, and that's how Pat ended up going to submarine school. And in the next version of this, I will tell you all about how Pat finished 109th out of a class out of 110, because they paid me, they gave me a lot of money, and I had nothing to do for about 16 hours a day when they were done with me, and I had a green ID card, which was like a license to drink in Groton, Connecticut. So I'll tell you that story next. Thanks for being here for my version of Submarine Stories. Again, I'm Patrick LeBlanc. I'm a TM1 SS, retired from the U.S. Navy, and I'm damn happy that you were here. Thank you very much.